Every monument in Washington, D.C., every history textbook in your school, and every political speech you have ever heard relies on a single, untouchable origin story. You are taught that the concepts of democracy, human rights, and personal liberty are uniquely Western inventions. You are told they were born in the marble columns of ancient Athens, resurrected by the brilliant philosophers of the European Enlightenment, and finally perfected by the founding fathers of the United States. You are taught to revere men like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin as the ultimate architects of the free world. We are told they invented the republic out of thin air, saving humanity from the tyranny of kings. But the foundational blueprint for a free society, the concept of a government that serves the people, the separation of powers, and the absolute right to personal liberty, were not born in the grand salons of Paris. They were not conceptualized in the halls of Philadelphia. They were systematically, deliberately appropriated from the very indigenous people the West was actively eradicating. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the democracy cover-up and how indigenous America actually wrote the blueprint for Western liberty. What follows is the story they absolutely do not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, if you want to know the actual history of how the modern world was built, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us start with the official timeline. The version of political history you were tested on in school. The narrative is heavily curated to make you believe that the Western mind is inherently wired for freedom. The textbook tells you that after the Dark Ages, Europe experienced an intellectual awakening called the Enlightenment. Brilliant men sat in ornate rooms, sipping coffee, and suddenly conceptualized the social contract. They debated the natural rights of man. They theorized that all men are created equal, and that a government should only exist through the consent of the governed. Then, according to the standard textbook narrative, the ultimate climax of human political evolution occurs in North America. A group of brilliant, isolated European colonists, fueled by this Enlightenment philosophy, bravely throw off the yoke of the British monarchy. They draft the Declaration of Independence. They write the United States Constitution. They brilliantly invent a system of checks and balances, a separation of powers, and a democratic republic. The West frames this as the undisputed triumph of European intellect. The United States claims the absolute title of the birthplace of modern democracy. We build massive marble monuments to these men, praising their unique, isolated genius. We are told that without them, the world would still be ruled by absolute monarchs and despots. This narrative is the most heavily guarded, sacred pillar of Western identity. It provides the moral justification for everything the West does. It allows the West to position itself as the global exporter of freedom. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the letters, the journals, and the physical reality of what Europe actually looked like before they made contact with the Americas, that beautiful narrative completely shatters. To understand the sheer scale of the intellectual theft, you have to look at the horrifying reality of European political life in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. Europe was not a cradle of liberty. It was a continent locked in a brutal, inescapable nightmare of authoritarian control. Look at the absolute monarchies of the era. The kings of France, England, and Spain did not just rule, they claimed the divine right of kings. They demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. The very concept of challenging the king was not just illegal, it was considered a sin against God himself. There was no freedom of speech. If you spoke out against the crown or the church, you were not just imprisoned, you were subjected to the horrors of the Inquisition. You were tortured, broken on the wheel, or burned alive in the public square. There was no equality. European society was built on a rigid, inescapable class system. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. You owned nothing. You had absolutely no political voice. You were effectively property, tied to the land of a wealthy lord. The wealth inequality was so staggering, so deeply ingrained in the DNA of the continent, that extreme poverty and mass starvation were considered the natural, unchangeable order of the universe. And perhaps most importantly, the European mind did not even possess the political vocabulary for personal liberty. The idea of a society functioning without a king, without a coercive state, without a massive, brutal police force to keep the peasants in line, was literally unfathomable to the European intellectual. If you asked a 17th century European philosopher to imagine a society of absolute equals, where leaders were chosen by the people and could be removed by the people, they would have told you it was impossible. They would have argued that human beings are inherently wicked and require a brutal, iron-fisted ruler to prevent total anarchy. They believed that hierarchy and violent coercion were the only ways a civilization could exist. So, how does a continent that is completely paralyzed by absolute monarchies, religious terror, and massive inequality suddenly, miraculously, invent the concepts of radical equality and democratic republics? The traditional Western narrative asks you to believe in a spontaneous, miraculous spark of European genius. They want you to believe that men like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau just woke up one day, looked around at their miserable, violently unequal continent, and independently imagined a perfect, egalitarian utopia out of thin air. But human history does not work in isolated vacuums. Political revolutions of that magnitude do not miraculously appear from nowhere. The philosophers of the European Enlightenment did not invent the concept of human liberty. They read about it. They read about it in the massive, highly detailed reports being sent back across the Atlantic Ocean by French Jesuit missionaries and early European explorers. Because when these Europeans arrived in North America, they did not find an empty wilderness, and they did not find primitive, unorganized populations. They encountered sophisticated, massively organized, highly complex political structures that completely shattered their European understanding of how human beings could live. They encountered societies that had been operating in perfect peace, with absolute personal liberty, for centuries before the first European ship ever crossed the ocean. And one political structure, above all others, shocked the European invaders to their core and provided the exact, working blueprint for the modern free world. Think about the psychological shock of that encounter. The French missionaries, men who had spent their entire lives bowing to kings, paying crushing taxes to wealthy lords, and witnessing the brutal execution of political dissidents, suddenly walked into the forests of the American Northeast. They sat down around the council fires of the indigenous populations, and what they saw completely broke their worldview. They saw leaders who did not wear crowns. They saw leaders who had absolutely no coercive power over their people. If an indigenous leader gave an order that the people did not agree with, the people simply ignored him. There was no royal guard to force compliance. There were no prisons to throw dissidents into. The European explorers wrote frantic, confused letters back to Paris and London. They described societies where no man was considered superior to another. They described a complete absence of the crushing poverty that defined the streets of London and Paris. They noted, with absolute bewilderment, that these people seemed to possess a natural, unbreakable sense of personal sovereignty. A French explorer named Louis Armand de l'Homme d'Ars, better known as the Baron de la Hontan, spent years living among the indigenous peoples in the late 1600s. When he returned to Europe, he published dialogues detailing his conversations with a Huron-Wendat leader named Candiaronk. Candiaronk was a brilliant, highly articulate political strategist, and in these published dialogues, Candiaronk absolutely dismantled the European system of government. He looked at the European obsession with money, their brutal class divisions, their corrupt judges, and their tyrannical kings, and he openly mocked them. He patiently explained to the Europeans that their entire civilization was built on slavery and misery. He explained the indigenous philosophy of natural law. He explained that a society must be built on mutual aid, absolute personal freedom, and the consensus of the community. These dialogues were not obscure texts. They were massive bestsellers across Europe. They were translated into multiple languages. They were read by every single major philosopher of the emerging Enlightenment. The European intellectuals were reading the direct, articulate political critiques from an indigenous American leader, and it was completely rewiring their brains. They were suddenly being handed the vocabulary and the physical proof that a free, egalitarian society was not just a theoretical fantasy. It was a physical reality, operating right now across the ocean. But encountering a free society is one thing. Building a massive federal republic out of separate, sovereign states requires a highly specific, complex architectural blueprint, and the West was about to steal the greatest political blueprint in human history. To find the exact, highly specific architectural blueprint for the United States Constitution, we have to look away from the libraries of Europe and focus directly on the upstate region of modern-day New York. We have to look at the Haudenosaunee, globally known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Long before the first European settler ever set foot on the continent, 5 distinct indigenous nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, later joined by the Tuscarora, were locked in a cycle of brutal, endless warfare. But centuries before the American Revolution, they made a monumental political decision. They decided to put down their weapons and form a massive, complex federal union. They united under a living constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. When you examine the Great Law of Peace, you are not looking at a primitive tribal agreement. You are looking at one of the most sophisticated, highly evolved pieces of political science in human history. It is the exact structural mirror of the modern democratic republic. The Western textbook teaches you that the brilliant European philosophers invented the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. The buried record proves that the Haudenosaunee had already perfected it. Their federal system had distinct branches of government. The Onondaga acted as the executive branch, the firekeepers who oversaw the council. The Mohawk and Seneca acted as the older brothers, essentially a senate, who debated policy first. The Cayuga and Oneida acted as the younger brothers, a house of representatives, who debated the policy second. No single nation could dominate the others. If a consensus could not be reached, the legislation was vetoed. They possessed a strict system of representative government. Leaders, called sachems, were not kings. They did not inherit their power through divine right. They were strictly public servants. And here is the ultimate, undeniable proof of their political superiority over Europe. They had achieved absolute gender equality in political power. In the rigid, patriarchal nightmare of Europe, women were legally considered property. But in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the clan mothers held the ultimate political authority. The women owned the land, the women controlled the economy, and most importantly, the clan mothers held the absolute power to nominate the male chiefs, and the absolute power to impeach and remove them if they violated the Great Law of Peace. This was a fully functioning, massive federal republic, operating in perfect harmony, guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the absolute right to personal sovereignty, centuries before the United States ever existed. So, how did this indigenous blueprint end up inside the United States Constitution? It did not happen by accident. It happened through direct, documented, and active plagiarism by the Founding Fathers. And the central architect of this heist was Benjamin Franklin. The Western narrative paints Benjamin Franklin as an isolated, folksy genius who flew a kite and invented the American political system. The buried record reveals that Franklin was a lifelong, obsessive student of the Iroquois Confederacy. Franklin was a printer by trade. For decades, his primary source of income was printing the highly complex treaty records between the American colonies and the indigenous nations. He was physically typesetting the political philosophy of the Haudenosaunee. He studied their federal structure. He marveled at their ability to maintain a massive union without a coercive police force or a king. In 1744, during a major treaty council in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, an Onondaga leader named Canasatego looked at the squabbling, divided European colonists. He saw that the English colonies were weak because they refused to unite. Canasatego gave a speech that permanently altered the course of human history. He literally handed the colonial governors the blueprint for a federal republic. He told them, on the historical record, to look at the Iroquois Confederacy. He advised the colonists to form a union exactly like theirs, so that they might become powerful. Benjamin Franklin was paying attention. A decade later, in 1754, Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, the very first official attempt to unite the American colonies under one federal government. When Franklin pitched this plan to his fellow colonists, he did not cite ancient Greece. He did not cite ancient Rome. He cited the Iroquois. He openly wrote that it would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages could form a union that lasted for ages, and yet 10 or a dozen English colonies could not do the exact same thing. Franklin literally took the federal framework of the Haudenosaunee, stripped away the powerful role of the clan mothers because the European patriarchal mind could not handle the concept of female power, and presented it to the colonial elite. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, when James Madison helped write the Constitution, they were not drawing on the miserable, tyrannical history of Europe. They were drawing on the living, breathing political reality of the indigenous nations that surrounded them. The concepts of states' rights versus federal power, the concept of a grand council, the concept of a living constitution that could be amended, These were all direct, physical appropriations of the great law of peace. The West did not invent democracy. They stole the blueprint. But the intellectual theft is only the first half of the democracy cover-up. The second half is one of the most brutal, hypocritical betrayals in the history of the human species. Once the American colonies used the indigenous blueprint to successfully rebel against the British Crown, once they built their glorious new republic based on the principles of liberty and justice for all, what did they do to the original authors of that freedom? They launched a massive, systemic campaign to annihilate them. In 1779, right in the middle of the American Revolution, George Washington, the so-called father of American liberty, ordered a massive military strike against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It was called the Sullivan Expedition. Washington's direct, written orders to his generals were not to conquer the Iroquois. His explicit orders were the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. He ordered his men to burn their massive agricultural fields, destroy their orchards, and burn over 40 highly advanced indigenous towns to the ground. He intended to starve the very people who had provided the architectural framework for his new nation. To the Haudenosaunee, George Washington is not known as the father of a free republic. He is known by the name they gave him, Town Destroyer. This is the deadly, sickening hypocrisy of the Western democratic myth. The Founding Fathers sat in Philadelphia, writing eloquent documents about the inalienable rights of man, using a political system they plagiarized from the Iroquois, while simultaneously ordering the violent eradication of the Iroquois people. And then, once the indigenous populations had been forced onto reservations, their populations decimated by disease and state-sponsored violence, the American government executed the final phase of the heist. They rewrote the history books. They built an impenetrable wall of colonial mythology. They declared that the indigenous peoples were primitive savages who possessed no complex society, no laws, and no understanding of liberty. They completely erased Canasatego. They erased the great law of peace. They erased the clan mothers. They took the massive, highly evolved political science of the Americas, copyrighted it under the names of white European men, and exported it back to the rest of the world as a triumph of Western genius. This is the ultimate perception overturn. When a civilization genuinely believes that it possesses a monopoly on freedom, they do not just write arrogant history books. They justify centuries of global violence. The myth of Western democratic supremacy has been used to justify the colonization of Africa, the subjugation of Asia, and the endless regime change wars of the modern era. The West constantly tells the world, "We must teach you how to be free." But the buried record demands intellectual justice. We build marble monuments to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. We carve their faces into mountains and print their faces on our currency. We praise their unique, isolated genius for inventing a republic out of the darkness. But the blueprint for the free world was not authored by the men in the powdered wigs. It was authored by the indigenous populations of the Americas. The West didn't invent liberty. They copied the framework, stripped it of its true egalitarian soul, and then spent centuries trying to physically destroy the original authors. The next time someone tells you that the United States is the oldest democracy in the world, remember the council fires of the Onondaga. Remember the absolute political authority of the clan mothers. Remember the great law of peace that was operating perfectly while Europe was still burning people at the stake for insulting a king. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the published dialogues of the Baron de Lahontan. It is in the exact text of Benjamin Franklin's letters. George Washington's orders for the Sullivan expedition are physically preserved in the National Archives. In 1988, the United States Senate even passed a resolution officially acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the U.S. Constitution. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is it kept out of your textbook? If this completely changed how you see the origins of democracy and the myth of Western liberty, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we will keep digging. But the intellectual heist of indigenous America did not stop with the drafting of the United States Constitution. The theft goes even deeper, reaching into the very core of modern European economic and political theory. We are taught that the great ideological debate of the 19th and 20th centuries, the massive global battle between capitalism and communism, was a purely European intellectual struggle. We are told that men like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels sat in the libraries of London and Germany, analyzed the brutal inequalities of the Industrial Revolution, and brilliantly conceptualized a classless, egalitarian society out of their own unmatched European intellect. But the buried record reveals that even the absolute founders of modern socialism were completely dependent on the indigenous American blueprint. In the mid-19th century, an American anthropologist named Lewis Henry Morgan spent years studying the remaining structures of the Haudenosaunee. He was absolutely mesmerized by their economic system. He documented, in exhaustive detail, that the Iroquois Confederacy did not possess the concept of private property. They did not have landlords. They did not have a billionaire ruling class hoarding the resources while the workers starved. The land, the resources, and the agricultural yield were held in common by the women of the clans. Morgan documented a society with absolute, unbreakable social security. If a family's crops failed, they took from the communal storehouse. There were no beggars on the streets of the Iroquois towns. There were no homeless people. There were no destitute orphans left to die in the cold, a scene that was entirely normalized in the civilized streets of Victorian London. The indigenous community absorbed everyone, and wealth was distributed based on need, not greed. Morgan published his meticulous findings in a massive book called Ancient Society. And who read this book with obsessive, frantic interest? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. When Engels read the detailed accounts of the Haudenosaunee, it completely validated everything he and Marx had been theorizing. Engels was so profoundly shocked by the Iroquois system that he used Morgan's research as the absolute foundational evidence for his famous book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Engels literally pointed directly at the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and wrote that their society, functioning perfectly without a coercive state, without police, without prisons, and without private property, was the undeniable, physical proof that a highly complex, classless society was scientifically and politically possible. The European socialist and communist movements did not invent the concept of communal equality. They looked across the Atlantic Ocean, saw the indigenous nations of the Americas practicing it flawlessly for centuries, and then translated it into German. Think about the staggering magnitude of this historical reality. Whether you were looking at the foundational architecture of the American capitalist republic, with its separation of powers and federalist structure, or you were looking at the foundational theories of European socialism, with its vision of a classless, egalitarian society, the root code is not European. The entire spectrum of modern Western political thought, from the deepest concepts of liberty to the most radical theories of equality, was fundamentally shaped, inspired, and directly plagiarized from the very indigenous societies that the West was actively attempting to erase from the face of the earth. We are living in a world built entirely on stolen indigenous blueprints, operating under a massive, multi-century European copyright. The West did not bring civilization to the Americas. The Americas provided the political and economic vocabulary that finally allowed the West to civilize itself. And the West's response to receiving the greatest political education in human history was genocide, followed by absolute historical amnesia. The next time you hear politicians debate the origins of the Constitution, or scholars debate the roots of political equality, demand that they cite their sources. Demand that they name the clan mothers. Demand that they acknowledge the great law of peace. Because until we correct the timeline, we are not just telling a bad version of history. We are actively participating in the ongoing erasure of the greatest political architects the world has ever known. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the heavily annotated notebooks of Karl Marx. It is in the published treatises of Friedrich Engels. The profound influence of the Haudenosaunee on the entire spectrum of Western political thought is an undeniable physical reality sitting in the archives. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why are they so terrified to teach you this? If this final revelation completely shattered the illusion of the Western political spectrum, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.